Let's go over some Passap basics. On the Passap knitting machine, some of the settings can be used without any pushers. All the pushers just stay in the rail, so even if you don't have pushers in good condition, they may be used. Those settings are N, CX, and EX, and several combinations of them. So we will explore those in this video. Before we begin, let's go over some must-know basics. One interesting thing to know is that for the non-electronic Passaps, both beds can do identical things. What do you suppose these are? They are called edge clips, and they should be placed on the needle with the latch closed on the very end needle. You can knit without them, but they're extremely helpful in keeping that last needle knitting neatly. It cuts down on drop stitches and other errors. The row counter trigger. The rows will increase over here. Note that it is anchored by one of the end clips. That's Passap's recommendation. You can take a prong tool and push that little lever up to move it around on occasions when you need this to be positioned differently. You are looking at a hybrid machine. The beds are from an old Pinky, quite old. These are from the more modern Duo 80, and they fit and they work fine. For double bed knitting, we use orange strippers. They're named orange, but the really old ones are red, like the one my thumb is holding. They work the same, and the shape of their pushing mechanism is the same. This one's getting a little raggedy. I will soon need to take an emery board and file it smooth. I can never make it as good as original, but the jagged edges will start to snag on the stitches, and that's even worse than it not being the same size as originally. For single bed knitting, we use a very different stripper, the black one. See, it's shaped differently. It has a wheel rather than this bow-shaped area. It has a different tine. This is a fairly modern one. The original ones that came with Pinkies were shaped a little differently. And the bed settings actually have to be different to accommodate one or the other. Either will work in either machine, but you may have to adjust your settings. The rule of thumb is for double bed work, we use orange. Single bed work, we use black. But that can get a little bit confusing. If both locks are set on N, then we'll get ribbing, and we definitely want this. If one lock is set on N and the other one on GX, which means it won't knit at all and no needles will be called up by the lock at all. It works the same as just putting all the needles out of work, but it's some insurance that nothing accidentally gets pushed into work. It's also what we use to make a free pass in case of a jam. A teacher I had long ago at a seminar said, "G is for get me out of here." So when we're using N on one bed, and it can be either one, and GX on the other, that's single bed knitting, and we use this. That's obvious. What about the case of CX? That causes each bed to knit going one direction. So you would think in your mind, it's double bed work. I'm using both of them. But you use these. And why is that? It's because one bed knits at a time. And these push down the stitches a little bit harder. It's the different strippers, that's what these are called, that make Passaps able to knit without any weight at all, even in some difficult circumstances. So that extra push is quite a help. This is the racking handle. Old-fashioned Passap patterns say handle up versus handle down. But I prefer to have you think about it in terms of what's happening on the beds. I'll get you over here where you can see. Handle is down. If I bring out all the needles, they'll pass one another. They'll alternate. So you can safely use all the needles on both beds as for full needle rib. Now, handle up. They oppose perfectly. They would crash into each other if I let them come all the way out. You wouldn't want that. So for a lot of times for single bed knitting, we do handle down so they alternate. I said single bed, I meant double bed. Certainly if all the needles on both beds are in work, we usually would. Right now, we are set on CX, which is for tubular knitting. Each bed will knit going one direction and the result will be a tube. Now I need to rack so that the needles oppose perfectly. Now they'll all crash into each other if I use them all at the same time, but I won't. And this is how you avoid getting a bump at the edge of the knitting right here, where the yarn moves from bed to bed. And here's why. It'll knit all right, as you will see. Back bed knitted, front bed knitted. But there's an angle between these two stitches which will actually adjoin on the finished product. Now I've flipped the back lock to in like this, so it should continue knitting stockinette. And we're going to change this one to GX, so it should not knit anything at all. Let's knit a few rows. You can see a couple rows have been knitted here, not on the front. So the back of the knitting just got longer. Now I'm going to try to change to GX on the back, and it should stop knitting in on the front. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the knitting is the same length, but we'll see when we take it off of here, there will be a little slot on each side. A tube at the bottom. The very bottom should have a bump. The next section should look a bit neater. Then there will be a little bit of a slit. I've been knitting with Yeoman Cashmelon on stitch size 7. This is the high end of what the Passap likes to knit. So now I have tied on, and I'm just going to knit through some tam estilo, which is much, much thinner. I don't usually try to do things like full needle rib or jacquard, double bed jacquard, with a yarn as thick as the Cashmelon on the Passap. It's not impossible, but it's pushing your luck. This, on the other hand, is a piece of cake. So we'll go ahead and knit it through so that you can see the fabric change. Assuming the knot knits through nicely for me. I got by with it. And when we get this tube off of the machine, you will see a distinct change in fabric. Now, because this is a much lighter fabric, I can now rack the beds for full needle rib. Handle goes down. Now those needles alternate and will not crash into each other. So I can set both beds on in, normal knitting, stockinette knitting, but with both knitting, it's going to be ribbed because one set of stitches is facing one way, one is facing the other. Also, I'm going to go down to, I think, stitch size 3.5. 3 to 4 is typically what I would choose here. So we'll just, aha. See it getting really difficult? That's why. This greater push down, it's much harder work for me and much harder on the yarn. It's not technically ruinous. Sometimes you can get by with it, but that's why they invented the orange strippers, to make it easier. Let's try that again with orange strippers. Certainly easier on me, and it's knitting very, very nicely. I have one stitch that keeps not quite knitting off. I'm going to get through this demo with it, but then I should tell you I'm going to look at whether there is a damaged latch or a bent needle there. And a stitch that misbehaves when everything else is fine is a signal to do just that. Let's try one of the last stitches that we can do without using any pushers. We can use NEX, EXN, or EXEX. That's two versions of half fisherman's rib. If one bed is left on N, as I'm going to leave the back bed first, that's half fisherman's rib. If both are on EX, it's full. So let's do a few rows on half with the front bed being the one. I'm starting to notice some stitches riding up, and that risks dropping them. Now, Passap was made in order to knit without weights, or to be possible to knit without weights. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to use some if you think it will help. And I do, so I'm going to put some on the fabric. Another thing I could do if I had them was to change to blue strippers. They are shaped much like orange, but they push down just a little harder. I don't have mine handy right now. I'm in the process of reorganizing, so I'm just going to use some claw weights for a little extra pull down and keep knitting NEX. One thing I should tell you, the old Passap books always designated the back bed first. That's why I said NEX. Now we're going to change to EXN. We just knitted one of the rows that makes this half fisherman's rib. Moving to the left, every stitch on the back bed tucked because it's on EX. That means it grabbed a loop and did not knit it off. I'm going to hand hold this camera in position so you can see the return row knitted every loop off. While this is going on, every single row is knitting off on the front bed because it's set on N for stockinette. But because the fabric is double-sided and the back bed is knitting 2, but tucking alternate rows, we're getting half fisherman's rib. Now, let's go to EXEX. Same stitch size. This is the only change. Now the beds take turns. One tucks, one knits in one pass, and then they swap positions. The other one tucks the next pass. There's our tubular area. You can see where I changed the racking. The edge did get a little bit neater. Where I knitted N on one bed with the other not knitting, and then N on the other We did get holes, but the tube stayed the same length. So for, say, a doll dress, you could potentially knit armholes that way. Here is where I naughtily knitted the knot through, but I got by with it. See how much looser the fabric appears when we change to still tubular knitting. See, it's open between the layers, but the much lighter yarn. Here comes the end section. The knit is identical on both sides, very skinny ribbing. This is an EX side. You can see the effect of tucking every other row. And here, the section below my thumb and above the full needle rib is where we change to EX on the other side. And the last few rows are EX, EX. And I want you to take note at how wide that can get because both beds are tucking. I once designed a shawl that would wrap twice around the body of most women and still have some leftover length using one width of knitting on the Passap, but EX, EX. It will get really wide, and it is completely reversible. It looks identical on both sides. My scissors are indicating the area where that faulty needle was misbehaving. That's the kind of thing you'll get before one completely fails, but when it really needs changing.